a few minutes. And then we'll take some questions from y'all. So if you'll just raise your hands using the react button at the bottom, then our host friends will be able to recognize that you're waiting to ask a question, and we can proceed in an orderly fashion. Thank you so much. All right, well, we still got some people kind of streaming in here. Maybe I'll give it one more minute.
Some old friends and new friends, and it's really nice.
Wait till 6:04. I will say okay to read recorded. Six oh four is taking too long. Let's get started. So my name is Ann Chelberg. I am the editor of the book reviewing newsletter Book Post. If any of you are coming to a Book Post related thing for the first time, it's a book reviewing newsletter where we also sometimes talk a bit about the book business and the reading business. And I certainly encourage you to go have a look at it if you haven't heard of it at books.substack.com. If you're here and you don't have a subscription, I would be happy to give one to you so you can have a look at it. Make a little note in the chat, and we'll send you a subscription in due course. We're all here today because April Bernard, the poet, essayist, and professor, was kind enough to do a summer reading group with Book Post this summer of the poems of Elizabeth Bishop. We've had two reading groups before, one with Mona Simpson of Middlemarch and one with Chris Benfey of My Antonia, by Willa Cather. And so if you are coming here without having read that, that's okay, but I do encourage you to go back and read it. If you go to books.substack.com and click on summer reading, you can see April's 4 installments with each of them discussing 3 poems by Bishop. That's sort of the background to today's conversation. And I also want to send out a super thanks to our bookstore host, Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York. They're a Book Post partner bookstore for the summer. We partner up with independent booksellers to send them our business and to show them appreciation, and they were kind enough to host today's event. So I'll just make an introduction of April. April Bernard is a poet, critic, and professor teaching creative writing in English at Skidmore, which also has, incidentally, Northshire as its hometown bookstore. Her most recent book, which I can hold up right now, The World Behind the World, very beautiful. You can purchase from Northshire. It's like, I think, her 6th book of poems. She's also written 2 novels and many, many essays about poetry and other subjects, which you can find on her website. She also occasionally does Zoom seminars and poetry workshops, which if you look on her website, you can find out about those in the future, and they must be a huge treat. So I encourage you to have a look. Welcome, April, and thank you so much for doing summer reading with us.
It's my pleasure. I just unmuted myself. I'm very pleased with.
Well done. A good start, technically. So let's just start off with a very simple question. I went to you and invited you to work with us or to do a summer reading group with us on absolutely any writer in the world, and you chose to write about Elizabeth Bishop. So maybe you could say a few words for us about what drew you to that.
Well, I've been very engaged with her work for all of my writing life. And I haven't written about her for a while. And I think I just unconsciously knew I wanted to write about her again. The last time I wrote about her was, 10 years ago. And I thought, or 15 years ago, maybe. And I thought, I think I have some other things to say. One of the reasons is because I teach her poetry a lot. And when I teach her poetry to student poets, I find over and over again how useful she is as a pedagogical tool, not just because the poems are great and it's great to read them, but because they exemplify something that I personally am extremely interested in as a writer and teacher, which is how form makes meaning. And she's constantly reinventing and redoing forms in her work. And I think that it is really, really useful for poets who are just getting started to understand that certain forms suit certain kinds of subject matter and certain forms do not. And then to also imagine themselves, I call it fancy stanzas, when you make up your own stanza forms or you make up your own alternates on forms that already exist. So we spend a lot of time with that. I don't think there is any such thing truly as free verse. I think all verse is formed. Some of it is very loosely formed, but all of it is formed. And I think she's a very interesting example of somebody who inherited a vast array of formal possibilities and then remade them for herself in the middle 20th century in a way that I think is still very instructive for us today. So that's why I like her so much. I mean, that's not why I love her, but that's why I like her. I love her because she's an incredible poet. But yeah.
Do students have the in their ears when you're teaching them, Bishop, the sort of reservoir of poetic, of formal understanding that a reader of Bishop's poems in her lifetime would have felt? Do you feel like you need to reteach that, or is it within the language itself?
No, 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 no. I need to reteach it every time I turn around. Yeah, I mean, just to even know, even to instruct people in what a regular iambic rhythm in English is tremendously helpful. If students can figure that out, if anyone can figure that out, they know about twice as much as they did before they started reading the poem. Not because she's always writing in iambic, she isn't, but if you can figure out how rhythm patterns work, you know a great deal more about what you're reading than if you don't. And no, it takes a lot of, there's not a lot of background in it.
Hmm. Yeah, well, your choice of roosters as a poem for us to read was very illustrative in that regard, because there's a lot of tension around the form, and you can really see how she uses it as a kind of a source of emphasis and drama.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, each of the poems that we talked about had a sort of very different gradation in its relationship to form.
yeah.
Do you think like this? I feel like this was a feature of the generation in which she came of age. Like many of them were moving away from formal writing, and she was close friends with, especially Lowell, and Moore had her own kind of break with the forms of the past. What is there about her particular sort of departure from writing traditionally that characterizes her poetry, do you think?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm buying the premise of your question. I know that but I understand that it is a generally understood way of looking at 20th century poetry, to see it as sort of in a kind of slide away from form. I just think it's a slide into other kinds of forms. And I would say, what I would say about Bishop is she's one of the least self-conscious users, in the sense that she doesn't get worked up about it when she wants to take a form and then torque it. But poets have been torquing form ever since forms existed. I mean, to look at the history of the sonnet, just to look at the most exemplary form in the English language, is to look at people messing with it over and over and over and over and over again, so that you have the original version and then you have ways to tweak it, adding lines, changing rhyme schemes, getting rid of rhymes, all kinds of things that happen to the thing that still remains somehow a sonnet and yet is wildly variant from it. The best, most recent example I can think of this is in Jericho Brown's The Tradition, where he takes the sonnet form and he's completely remade it. It doesn't look like a sonnet to me at all, but he says it's partly a sonnet and partly blues and partly a villanelle, and I think it's also partly a ghazal. And he's doing all kinds of interesting things with it, but it still retains a kind of what I would say would be an unself-conscious relationship to the idea that the tradition and that forms matter. And I don't think that even the most wildly free verse example you can come up with in modernism or anything else, I mean, maybe somebody like William Carlos Williams, he's constantly making new forms. They're just not the old forms, they're new forms.
Well, well said. I wanted before he passes out to kind of bring forward Tony Domestico, who's one of our frequent book post critics and who was with us a little bit in the comments. If those of you who haven't read April's installments for summer reading, if you go back to them and if you comment in the comments, I think those of us who are in there would love to go back and engage with you. It's not over yet. The comments are an ongoing story. But I thought I might kind of really give Tony a moment to ask a question or say hello, because he also interviewed you in Commonweal for your last book. And I encourage people to look that up. And let me turn the stage over to him and invite him to weigh in.
Yeah. So what you were just saying, April, made me think of Eliot's essay on free verse, right? Where he basically says the same thing. He said there's no such thing as free verse. There's no such thing as dispensing with rhyme and in meter either. But what I was struck by and what I wanted to ask you about, so Langdon Hammer, who you probably know is writing a biography of Bishop right now.
Yes.
When he taught a course on modern poetry, and he talked about Bishop as exemplifying what he described as a horizontal poetics, by which he was contrasting it with the more vertical poetics of someone like Eliot or Stevens, which is kind of visionary, religious in a certain sense, but certainly moving from this world into something beyond. And I was struck by how often in your reflections you noted the moments of flight and expansion upward at the end of Bishop's poems, right? Like at the fish houses, you heard Herbert and Hopkins, two definitely vertical poets.
Yes.
And baptism and flight comes up at the end of sonnet. And so I was just interested to hear how you think about Bishop in relation to horizontality and verticality, if that makes sense.
Well, I know Langdon Hammer really well. I've known him for years, and we've had gentle arguments on this subject. Because I think that he's absolutely right about there's a quality of the common woman or the common man about Bishop, and a kind of a refusal to be. So when I think of horizontality, I think of what I talked about a lot in my notes about this shared thing that she's inviting you in next to her to read with her or to look at with her, and that has a kind of democratic and fellow feeling quality, which feels more horizontal than a top down, I'm telling you what's what, I'm telling you about the world, I'm giving you instructions on how to live, which she never does. So I think in that sense, if Lanny means horizontal in that sense, I think he's absolutely right. But I actually think she constantly pushes against the material world towards a spiritual place. She may feel that it can't be achieved, but she's looking for it all the time. I think it's one of the reasons I feel so close to her in my own poetics. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I
Was that helpful?
no, that's perfect. And that's kind of what I assumed. I assumed you would push back against that, her as a kind of anti-transcendent poet, because just though she's interested in the horizontal, in the material, certainly does not mean that, especially at the end of her poems, it doesn't often open up into something mysterious beyond the horizontal.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. I think it does a lot. And I think that I don't think that the transcendental impulse ever is without an attachment to the material world. I think it finds its way to the spiritual through the material, and that's what she's often doing. She also, to be fair to certainly to Lanny's reading, she's also often saying that it can't be done. I mean, there's a lot of throwing up of the hands and saying, I don't know. She's not preaching. She absolutely isn't preaching like a minister or a spiritual leader. She's got a lot of I don't know about her. And it's one of the reasons I love her so much. And it's also one of the reasons I connect her mentally with Chekhov, who also, while raised in a spiritual tradition, as was Bishop, and has that impulse constantly, is also often going, oh, I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And thanks for all the responses. They were really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for dragging yourself out of bed to join us. I hope you feel better. I wanted to invite some of our commenters who are here, Amanda, Daniel, Mary Jo, if they would if they would like to come forward with questions. Any of you guys have a question, or have you asked them all already?
I'm afraid I didn't always answer everybody's questions. I found that the comment section a little overwhelming as I was going about my weeks. So I often enjoyed reading them, but didn't really have time to get back and respond in depth. I apologize for that.
Well, it's been a real opener for Book Post because you know, this form of doing these newsletters is, as it's practiced by lots of people, quite interactive. But I'm used to book reviewing where the book review just goes forth, you know. And so I so these readings have really invited the readers in a way, these reading groups that we haven't had before, and it's been really fun. A real change of pace. All right, I'm not seeing any questions from the commenters, so let's just throw open the field. Anybody
I
else?
saw a hand up there. Yes,
Are
Daniel.
you seeing them?
I was curious, April, why you decided to organize the course, if you will, according to the 4 places. And just to be controversial, I'll raise a possible objection to that.
You're right.
Bishop was,
okay.
No, go ahead.
And then I'll yak at you.
Well, my possible objection to that is that Bishop is always in more than one place. That I mentioned in one of my comments that she had perfect recall of her childhood only when she got to Brazil, and that the structure of Questions of Travel really signals, as does the title North and South, that she's kind of committed to a multi locational sensibility, if you will.
Well, she also did mostly live in those 4 places. And I felt that since I was going to be writing for not necessarily experts on Bishop, but a whole range of people that I wanted to invite to read her poetry in greater depth, it seemed to me to be sensible to, at least in part, have a chronology of the poems through her life. That was my only feeling about it. The other thing is that I know I could have just said early, middle, late, middle, late, but those are the places she lived, and she cared a lot about geography, so that made sense to me. But I also think it's important to understand what I was trying to do was to lead the reader through an understanding of how she enlarged upon and developed and complicated her relationship to form. So that's why I wanted to do it chronologically. And you're right, chronology doesn't necessarily include naming all the places she lived, but those were the main places that are associated with her and where she lived. And I didn't meet her till she was in Boston, but so that's the end of her life.
Great.
Since I'm the editor, I get to just take the privilege of jumping in. Which I also feel as though it gave you an opportunity to use how she drew on the specificity of realia. You know, that the individual chapters didn't stay embedded in those places. I mean, you use the poem Maps, which is all over the place, and Questions of Travel, and Crusoe is also like in imaginary places or other places, but it gave an opportunity, as you know, and I think it's Santarem where this thing comes up of why travel, and then it's coming into the specifics of experience that kind of provides a sort of seed for an answer. It gave an occasion to make those relationships visible.
I also think it's really important where writers write. And although the only exception to that really is probably Santarem, or maybe Questions of Travel also, it certainly didn't get written in Nova Scotia, although it has Nova Scotia in it. I think that it's really important where writers are when they're writing. So I think that, for instance, there's something incredibly important about Key West. When she was living in Key West and she started writing a very different kind of mature poem in Key West. And I think that there's something about the landscape of Key West and the sort of the important shock to the system of living in a different climate and with different kinds of people around is really, it's really interesting and important in a writer's life, writing life.
Thanks. That's
Thank
great.
you. So I think Mary Jo, we have Amanda has her hand up. Let's go Mary Jo and then Amanda.
Okay, hi, and thank you, April. I feel like I need to go back and reread all the posts and all the comments and just think about form, because I don't think I thought about that enough. But I've been thinking about, before joining this conversation, about the title, her last book, Geography 3, and thinking about the title. And I wonder if you sort of intimated that you were going to talk about the moose, and I was thinking of all the poems that are there, these great poems. I guess like she worked on them throughout her life, but I love the way that they all revisit these past scenes and places, from Worcester to, I guess an island environment, or a southern environment, to Nova Scotia, to, there's just a lot. And then landscapes right immediately around her, like seeing the city from a plane, and then looking at her desk in terms of a landscape. But I guess I was really thinking about like how these poems, they seem to me to be opening out, because we talked a lot about solitude and loneliness and getting out of that. And I just feel like, she had lost her lover, 2 lovers, I guess. But I just feel in these poems like a lot of expansiveness, that she's connecting all the time with like the people in the National Geographic, or the people on the bus, or there's that gathering of different people's perspectives. And I'm thinking do you think that could have come from her experience of sharing in the classroom? And I'm thinking Geography 3.
Oh, I can really answer that.
Pedagogical, but I'm also wondering if it relates to the title of Herbert's Love 3.
Yes. What specifically in Herbert's Love 3?
Well, the title, the way she has Geography 3 and Love 3.
Oh, maybe. I mean, she did love Herbert, but I've always felt that she was just thinking in terms of
the title of a geography, yeah,
a primer of some kind.
Yeah,
you're right. It might very well be an echo of Herbert. I hadn't thought of that. That's lovely. That's really lovely.
Because they're about encounter. It's about more encounter with the world.
I know for a fact, because I got to know her well enough for her to be candid with me, she absolutely hated teaching. She absolutely hated it. She just hated it. The only thing she liked about it, she said, was that she got to make some new friends. That's it. She really was not suited to the classroom. She was not a great classroom teacher. She was, it was just not her thing. She was much more a one-to-one kind of a person. She was crowds, groups did not do it for her. She was really unhappy when most of the time she was teaching at Harvard. And yeah, it wasn't what she wanted. But the other thing I will say is that, yes, she had lost a beloved figure in her life, and we can know that. We do know that biographically. But I don't think it's that simple. I don't think the issues of solitude or community are simply about whether or not you have a partner. No. I think the condition of being solitary in life is something that I think that she would have said comes from childhood. And loss comes from childhood. One of the things that's beautiful in Geography 3, that wonderful book, is the way in which so many of the poems return to questions about about childhood security. One of the reasons I love The Moose so much is that it's actually a poem like that poem I talked about in my first post, like the little exercise, or maybe the second post, the poem about little exercise, which is a way of teaching yourself to not be afraid of thunderstorms so you can go to sleep. Similarly, in The Moose, the whole poem is designed to bring us into a state of childhood comfort and relaxation so that we almost fall asleep because we can hear the old people in the bus behind us. And then the moose that comes and kind of fronts us from the bus becomes a shared wonder. And it's very, very, the whole mood of it is consoling. The whole mood of it is a kind of like a child's fairy tale. And she does that several times in this book. So I think that that's just an interesting point about the issue of solitude and comfort, and her trying to find a way to write her way into it with memories of childhood or evocations of comfort in childhood.
It occurred to me that in Crusoe, he forgets the end of that Wordsworth line, which is the bliss of solitude.
Yes.
Because, yeah, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but I do feel like she has her Crusoe think back to the island as a more or less blissful time, even though it was very hard, because he was engaged with things in a survivalist way.
Yes.
And I don't know that
I'm not
I don't
sure
know
either.
that Friday is like, that's a weird, like, and then, you know, it was horrible, but then Friday came, or I thought, just when I thought I couldn't stand it a moment longer, Friday came. I mean, maybe, but I feel like what he remembers when he goes back to England and is supposedly rescued is, you know, the interesting lumber and the knife and things of that sort.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You do you feel that we've had our segue to the moose, which April, you made a promise that you would talk about. Do you
I
feel
promised a former student of mine, and she isn't even here.
Oh, okay, so
But I did promise her that I would talk about the moose in this chat. I don't know whether everybody wants to hear about the moose or not. But if
everyone's nodding vigorously.
familiar it is to everyone off the tops of their heads. So that's one of the problems. But some of you know the moose, so I can talk about it a little bit more. I mean, I've already talked about it a little bit. Did you want me to read something? Should I? It's a long poem.
The moose is long.
Read it to you. Do you all have your texts? It's like is this a classroom? You all have your text. Yes, some of you do. I will read you the moose. And here's what I want you to pay attention to in form as we're reading it. How's that? I'll give you an instruction. The instruction is to notice the stanza form she's invented, which is really quite beautiful. And I've never seen anyone else do it. But I'm going to point it out to you, is that she basically uses 3-beat lines, sometimes 2-beat, once in a while a 4-beat line, but basically they're 3-beat lines, and they're in 6-line stanzas, and the last line always rhymes up, but it rhymes irregularly. So each time we come to the end of a stanza, there's a rounding out of the sense of it, because it does rhyme up, but it never rhymes the same way. And sometimes there's more than one rhyme, and sometimes there's often other rhymes in there too. So she's playing that game that I've pointed out, not game, but she's playing around with rhyme to both make you anticipate it and also make you uneasy, because it's not going to be a comfortable regular rhyme. It's going to be just a little bit off. But every single stanza does resolve with a beautiful rhyme at the end. And that creates a big part of the comfortableness and the comfort of this poem. The other thing to notice is that it starts almost like if they'd had drones, almost like a cinematic from a helicopter shot. It comes in on the bus, and then the speaker of the poem gets on the bus and then is in the bus. So it's very cinematic also in the way she's doing that, but she does it very subtly. Here we go, The Moose, for Grace Bulmer Bowers. From narrow provinces of fish and bread and tea, home of the long tides, where the bay leaves the sea twice a day and takes the herrings long rides, where if the river enters or retreats in a wall of brown foam depends on if it meets the bay coming in, the bay not at home, where silted red, sometimes the sun sets facing a red sea, and others veins the flats, lavender, rich mud, in burning rivulets. On red, gravelly roads, down rows of sugar maples, past clabbered farmhouses and neat clabbered churches, bleached, rigid as clamshells, past twin silver birches. Through late afternoon, a bus journeys west, the windshield flashing pink, pink glancing off of metal, brushing the dented flank of blue beat up enamel. Down hollows, up rises, and waits patient while a lone traveler gives kisses and embraces to 7 relatives and a collie supervises. Goodbye to the elms, to the farm, to the dog. The bus starts. The light grows richer, the fog, shifting, salty, thin, comes closing in. Its cold, round crystals form and slide and settle in the white hen's feathers, in gray glazed cabbages, on the cabbage roses and lupins like apostles. The sweet peas cling to their wet white string on the whitewashed fences. Bumblebees creep inside the foxgloves, and evening commences. One stop at Bass River, then the economies, lower, middle, upper. 5 islands, 5 houses, where a woman shakes a tablecloth out after supper. A pale flickering, gone. The Tantrammer marshes and the smell of salt hay. An iron bridge trembles and a loose plank rattles, but doesn't give way. On the left, a red light swims through the dark, a ship's port lantern. 2 rubber boots show, illuminated, solemn. A dog gives 1 bark. A woman climbs in with 2 market bags, brisk, freckled, elderly. A grand night, yes, sir, all the way to Boston. She regards us amicably. Moonlight as we enter the New Brunswick woods, hairy, scratchy, splintery, moonlight and mist caught in them like lamb's wool on bushes in a pasture. The passengers lie back, snores, some long sighs. A dreamy divagation begins in the night, a gentle, auditory, slow hallucination. In the creakings and noises, an old conversation, not concerning us, but recognizable somewhere back in the bus. Grandparents' voices, uninterruptedly talking in eternity, names being mentioned, things cleared up finally. What he said, what she said, who got pensioned, deaths and sicknesses, the year he remarried, the year something happened. She died in childbirth. That was the son lost when the schooner foundered. He took to drink, yes. She went to the bad when Amos began to pray even in the store, and finally the family had to put him away. Yes, that peculiar affirmative. Yes, a sharp indrawn breath, half groan, half acceptance that means life's like that. We know it, also death. Talking the way they talked in the old featherbed, peacefully on and on, dim lamplight in the hall, down in the kitchen, the dog tucked in her shawl. Now, it's all right now, even to fall asleep, just as on all those nights. Suddenly, the bus driver stops with a jolt, turns off his lights. A moose has come out of the impenetrable wood, and stands there, looms rather, in the middle of the road. It approaches, it sniffs at the bus's hot hood, towering, antlerless, high as a church, homely as a house, or safe as houses. A man's voice assures us, perfectly harmless. Some of the passengers exclaim in whispers, childishly, softly, sure are big creatures. It's awful plain. Look, it's a she. Taking her time, she looks the bus over, grand, otherworldly. Why do we all feel, this sweet sensation of joy? Curious creatures, says our quiet driver, rolling his R's. Look at that, would you? Then he shifts gears. For a moment longer, by craning backward, the moose can be seen on the moonlit macadam. Then there's a dim smell of moose, an acrid smell of gasoline. God, I love that poem.
Thank you.
Who wants to say something about that poem besides me? Or ask me something about it? I don't care.
I just had a little thought that the unexpected rhymes are like things coming in and out of view as the bus moves.
That's nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think the parenthetical? I think that's just like, I love that parenthetical, and I love the line, now it's all right now.
Mm. Yeah. Of the parentheticals, she's just real good at them, isn't she?
Yeah.
I mean, that's when we are reminded that she's talking to us, among other
Mhm.
things. Yeah. There's
Amanda? Oh,
there's
sorry.
no doubt that this is a person talking to you as you read it.
Mhm.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Anna, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, I'm playing out the moose for as long as it wants to go.
Yeah, me too. I love this poem. I think I talked in one of my posts about the standard trope in poetry since the Romantics, at least, probably sooner, but this idea of fronting the other in nature and having a moment of sort of contact with the numinous or the sublime. And it doesn't always go the way you think it's going to go. There's that wonderful poem called "The Most of It" by Robert Frost about seeing a stag. There's all those places in Wordsworth where he practically has a heart attack at the sight of nighttime. The idea of nature being shocking and looking back at us. I mean, there's all those wonderful Rilke poems of in those zoo poems and those other poems where he looks at a panther or he looks at a gazelle and then or he looks at an archaic torso of Apollo, and it's looking back at him. And I think that there's certainly Bishop has that sort of cache of poetic tropes in mind when she encounters this moose. And it's meant to be both a kind of, it has a comical quality because moose look comical in the wilderness, and it's a bus encountering a moose, and it's all these ordinary people on a bus, but it's also, it's very much like a children's fairy tale where, or a happy children's story, not so much like a Grimm's Brothers fairy tale, but like a happy story where, you know, let's tell the story of how when grandma was on the bus, she met a moose. You know, it's got that kind of quality. And she is the person who gets on the bus, a lone traveler. She's a lone traveler. Once again, the solitude is there. A lone traveler gives kisses and embraces to 7 relatives, and a collie supervises. And those of you who know something about the biography know that Grace Fulmer Bowers was her cousin. So I'm assuming that she's been spending time up in Nova Scotia with the cousins, and she gets on the bus and she goes back to Boston. And that this is a memory of one of those visits, and it's from that. And so she is the lone traveler who then, once she's on the bus, she says goodbye to the elms, to the farm, to the dog. She has taken over. But before that, she's just looking at the bus either coming down the road from a great distance, or she's somehow in some kind of aerial position and she's watching the bus come in. but she's not on it yet until that happens. And then when she's on the bus, it is a continuation of the familial, because she's been visiting family, the speaker's been visiting family, and there's a continuation of that familial sense of comfort, and it's all right now to fall asleep. It's safe to fall asleep. The safety of the moose. This moose is safe as houses. The safety thing of being a child that's allowed to be lulled and rocked to sleep, even as the older people are talking about dangerous or unpleasant stories. But it's family stories, and they're going to keep talking, and you kind of listen and you kind of don't, and then you fall asleep. And she brings us as readers into this kind of half coma of being half asleep with her on the bus. And then we all wake up to front the moose, and we see the moose. And there's not much more to it than, oh, look at that incredible moose. But as Bishop wants us to do over and over again, she wants us to share the looking at something with her. So we now are also looking at the moose. And so that shared experience of observation and a shared encounter becomes the meaning of the poem itself. It becomes a form of communion, and where the interiority of the poet meets the interiority of the reader, and we do so by looking at something together. So it's profoundly, it has a profound spiritual and ethical meaning, this work of hers. This, and what I would, stealing, I think, from Lanny, but the idea of the horizontal, the side-by-sideness of the writer with the reader to share in that view. It's very beautiful to me.
Yeah, Amanda, you were wanting to ask a question before.
Oh, thanks. I was just wondering, because this is I'm familiar with there's a shorter version of the moose. Is there not? This seems like a longer version, no?
Nope.
Okay.
That's the one. I mean, it's possible you've read, a version somebody was talking about and they only quoted a couple of stanzas, but this is the poem.
No, this one seems almost talky in comparison, but I was just gonna, well, what Dan said about place, and in this recent reading of Bishop, I felt like that, yeah, maybe the place is not as important as like the distance, and that she's always sort of navigating these distances, and one place is, like Dan said, her childhood, that she's always kind of moving back and forth between these two like states or locations, like that are almost a mental or psychological. But and to me that's like connected with a voice, and sometimes like in the map I'm like, where is that, whose voice is this, where is it coming from? It's almost a disembodied voice in a way. And I did kind of always look for the voice and where it's coming from, and I found it hard to kind of feel close to it sometimes. I think it takes repeated readings maybe. But
Well, I mean, it's important. It's maybe helpful to remember how close she was with Robert Lowell as a fellow poet who was also exploring, sometimes deeply and sometimes somewhat gingerly, a kind of a newer poetics of talking about yourself and your childhood troubles. And that she got more interested in writing about her childhood, probably also, I mean, just, this is again biographical and anecdotal, but who wouldn't be? I mean, she was in analysis, and so was Lowell, and he wrote memorably and importantly about his childhood. And so I think that it was not surprising that she was wanting to do the same, and to do it more as she got older, in trying to trace certain psychologically acute interests into a childhood place. I would say that her voice has always been, I mean, you have your own experience and it's absolutely authentically yours, but I have always been, I think the first time I ever read her, I became alarmingly aware of her voice. It was almost like it was talking in my ear. I'm not claustrophobically, but a little bit uncannily. I have always heard her voice, even when I had her book of poems in high school, and once I'd read a poem, I bought a book of poems, and I would read them all the time. And half the time, I had no idea what I was reading. They were much too difficult for me when I was still in high school. I couldn't, nobody was there to explain them to me. So I kind of spent a lot of time with them. But I did have this uncanny sense of someone speaking very, very intensely and directly to me.
Mhm.
And it was so it was kind of funny to meet her at last years later, and to discover how she was so good at what James Merrill called her impersonation of an ordinary woman. It was a very good impersonation.
Thank you.
As you got to know her better, did the voice you knew from the poem sort of converge? With
But she was also, I'm not saying anything bad about her, because I wouldn't allow anybody to do that, including myself, but she was a really bad reader in public. She was so shy. And so if you try to listen to recordings of her reading, it just sounds terrible. It's this kind of dry, nervous, pinched voice, not like her voice talking to her at all. She was very, very, very afraid of public performance, and she just didn't like it. And so you don't really get the sense of that, which is a shame. Yeah, when she was relaxed, she sounded so much. I have relatives from Canada. I have relatives from Nova Scotia. I have relatives from Halifax. I have relatives from northern New England. She's just sounded like all my aunts. It's really funny, except a genius pretending to be one of my aunts.
anyone else like to ask a question? Nick.
Hi. I just want to say how much I loved your reading of The Moose, which I've carried around her paperback for my whole life, and I guess I thought it was too long, that I couldn't handle it. And I've lived in Maine now for 20 some years, and I've never seen a moose. So this is my first sighting of a moose right here, and I'm really thrilled about that. And I wanted to, because you were talking about the class and her shyness and everything, I guess I just wanted to form a picture in my mind of what the classroom looked like, and how she might begin a class. I know they were devoted to individual poets, but did she read the poets herself aloud? Did she start by asking someone to read it? That kind of thing.
She really, I'm afraid this is going to sound like a slapstick. She would come in late. She would look upset. There was a small seminar table. Half the class quit halfway through because first of all, they didn't know who she was. I may have been one of the only people in the room who actually knew who she was. She wasn't famous yet. Seriously famous. She wasn't until she died. And she would read, a Frost poem in that sort of drone, and then expect us to say interesting things about it. And when people would say things that weren't interesting, she would say, "That's not very interesting." She was she really, I never she taught a couple of workshops too, as well as literature classes. I never took a workshop with her, thank God. But because then I wouldn't have wanted to spend any time with her at all. But I appreciated her. She just wasn't going to suffer fools, but she really didn't understand what the transaction was supposed to be in a classroom. She wasn't buying into it. Whatever else was happening, she wasn't buying into it. And anybody who asked her a stupid question, she would say, "Look it up in the dictionary." She'd just say it like that, "Look it up in the dictionary." It was really, I would never have invited myself to go to her house, but my friend Sam was just irrepressible. And so he said, "Come on, let's go." And she was a totally different person outside of the classroom. The setting for the classroom was the basement of one of those houses at Harvard, I don't know, Winthrop or something. And it was kind of a basement room with loud pipes and windows up high and a kind of a big seminar table. And by the class, just, I think it must have had 8 people in it by the time we were done. And it was just the only ones of us. I mean, I would have listened to her read the telephone book because I already knew what I thought about her and her work. But it was a pretty narrow group that stuck with it. Yeah. What else?
Amazing.
Did you have a follow-up?
Oh, I just wanted, the chronology, had you read The Moose, for instance?
No, but The Moose was read to me. The book came out in 1977, I think. Yes, came out in 77. I was then taking a class with Robert Fitzgerald, the great translator poet, who had also been responsible for bringing Bishop to Harvard. And we were having our seminar, but I was having my individual tutorial meeting with him. And he brought out this copy of Geography 3 and gave it to me as a present and had his own copy. And we read The Moose together. And when he got to the line, "and the evening commences," he made a little noise. Fitzgerald had a little noise he made when something fabulous had happened on the page. He'd go, "Oh, oh." And when he got that to "and evening commences," inside the foxglove, "and evening commences," and he went, "Oh." And we traded off stanzas. And yeah, I've never lost this. And that's when I read The Moose for the first time. But I had already taken a class with her at that point, I think. Or maybe it was the same semester I was taking a class with her. But I got to know her better after I wasn't in the class. And I just would visit her as a person.
I wonder if any of the other poets among us ever met her. Not to call you out. Nobody's stepping forward.
I never met her.
Did Henri meet her? Henri, did you ever meet her?
No,
No.
no,
Grace,
no,
did you
but I
ever-
loved hearing you read The Moose.
Thank you, sweetie.
Oh, Grace, I think you're muted. Could you unmute for us? Oh, we're missing her.
I don't see. I don't.
Here we
see-
go.
She came to my house once after she read it, The Why.
Grace, I didn't see you there. Hi.
Hi, April. Hello.
Hello, dear.
I thank you, April, for what you said about form. It was so succinct and so incisive and so right. And I could hear that form in the Moose attention between the speaking voice and the naturalness of the voice and the regularity of the stanza form. I could hear it as you read it. Very interesting reading. She came to my house after she read it, The Why, and she sang a song. She sang laundry, shirts and collars, all the things that go into the laundry to the tune of Yankee Doodle.
That sounds pretty great. She would sometimes ask me to sing. She really loved folk songs and ditties a lot. That was very clear. I remember singing a sea chanty for her. I wish I heard her sing. I don't remember her singing. If she did, she might have joined in. I can't remember.
She must
Wow, I'm sure glad you unmuted, Grace. I wouldn't want to have missed that. That reminds me that you told us about how to recognize a ballad form by singing all the different things you can sing.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I remember what I sang for her. I sang her, I had set the Greek alphabet to that German, whatever that German song is. So Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, Zeta, Eta, Theta, Iota, Kappa, Lambda, Mu, Nu, Psi, Omicron, Pi, Rho, Sigma, Tau, and Epsilon, Phi, Chi, Psi, Omega. She just thought that was hilarious. Yes, I do remember that because I was taking a Greek class and I couldn't remember even the alphabet. I was so bad at it. I could only remember it with a mnemonic. Yeah. She thought that was pretty funny.
That is quite an erudite joke.
April, one thing I could add is that I had the opportunity a few summers ago to go up and stay in her house in Great Village. Well, I guess it was
It
her
turned into a
grandmother.
place that people can stay.
Yes,
I
yes.
didn't know that. Yeah.
It's I guess it's owned by the Baptist Church now. Well, there are only two churches there. It's owned by one of them. And, you know, believe it or not, for $50 a week, I think you can stay there. But it was, you know, it filled me with even more imagination, more admiration and imagination because it's just a tiny little spot, you know, and to think this person came from there is extraordinary.
Yes.
It's across the street from a gas station, and you know there are churches on either side of it.
Yeah. That's lovely. I'd love to go see that. I've never, yeah, I would love to go see that. I must drive up and just look at it. I don't think I'd want to stay there though. I have a very, almost a superstitious feeling about
Sure.
houses. They've creeped me out.
Well, the
You've written
bedroom,
about this, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
the bedroom where you
Every
sleep
time
is
I go to someone's house, I feel a little bit scorned by April.
What were you saying, Henri, about the bedroom?
well, the master bedroom is where her mother, you know, where her mother,
Yeah, yeah, had her breakdown. Yes, exactly. I think that might feel a little oppressive to me, but I'd love to see the town. Could you figure out where the fish houses were?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the drive, I did go through all the economies, as they're called in this poem. You know, the road goes right through. I never understood that line when I read it as a young man, but when I drove that road, then, you know, they're called the five economies, you know.
Yes, they are. I remember I looked it up on a map just to make sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There's that strange thing about her earnestness about factual detail, which is really, really intense. And I can share something with you, which is that in my copy of Geography 3, she amended a line because she realized she had made a slight error. And in the poem called The Waiting Room, I don't know if you can see it, but she's written a little line on the bottom. And she says that she was reading the National Geographic of February 1918. And at the bottom, she says, slight mistake. This is the March number. So she found out after she published it that it wasn't February, it was actually March. That kind of thing drove her crazy. So she's so precise. There's something about knowing that I think that helps a lot. I don't know what it helps, but it does help a lot. Oh, and since I'm doing show and tell, I mentioned the slightly larger than an old dollar bill version of poem, which she gave me, which is it was published by the Phoenix Bookshop, and she had one lying around and she gave it to me. And because she knew I loved that poem so much. And it's very beautiful inside. And it's
so simple.
Very simple. Same kind of typeface that similar. I think it's a Garamond face also, maybe slightly thicker than the one that that Farrar Straus uses. But yeah, it's beautiful. Anyway, that was show and tell.
Do you have an opinion about any of the movies or documentaries that have been made about her?
I feel like I'm such a grouch that I think that most of my responses are grouchy. It's not because I feel like Which one are you thinking of? Are you thinking of the Voices and Visions one, or?
Well, I just showed that one to my students, but I watched the other night the one called Reaching for the Moon.
Oh, yes. No, I deliberately did not see that.
Yeah, that's,
I thought it would
that's
distress me.
I didn't even think I could show it to my students, but I wondered what you made of it.
Oh, well, I mean, the little that I knew of her as a person suggests to me that she would have found it most impertinent for people to be talking about her sex life, but in any way whatsoever. But that's her generation and that's her time. You know, when people are dead, they're fair game. I just don't. She doesn't seem very dead to me. She seems like she's still alive. So I feel a kind of protective protectiveness and decorum about her, I think, which is, you know, nobody else has to feel that way. Yes.
I saw you even have a poem called Against Biography.
Yes, it's not about her. That was about Louise Bogan, actually. Yeah.
Oh, really? Interesting. But
Yes.
it seems to apply.
It does. I don't know if I'm consistent about this. I love reading biographies, but sometimes they terrify me. I'm sure, actually, speaking of biographies, I don't know if you've all had a chance to read Langdon Hammer's biography of James Merrill, but it's absolutely spectacular. And I'm convinced he's going to do an incredible job with Bishop. I think it's going to be, I'm looking forward to it very, very much.
Well, we were kind of slated to wrap up after an hour. Nothing bad seems to be happening. Nick, did you have one last thing or?
Oh, thank you. Well, I just, I have no doubt that you're absolutely right that she was a terrible reader, but I just want somehow to say that her reading of The Fish, which is, I think, something she did at the Library of Congress, there's something so moving to me about the way she delivers the words without any fuss. It's sort of anti-grandeur. It fits exactly with what she's trying to do in writing that kind of miniature short story. So
Yeah.
I loved her reading of The Fish, even though it has none of the trappings of a kind of poetry reading performance at all. And it was sort of self-surprised, you know. She reaches the end and she says, and I let the fish go, and it just trails off beautifully. It's really touching. So I think maybe she had a good day.
I think she's really good. Well, what you just said about how she reads it is really worth thinking about with that poem, because I think that poem that just does jump off into the ether is also the understatedness of it. Is just her management of understatement and the sort of the spectacular that is dressed up in the unspectacular is really amazing. She once wrote that the only problem she had with Portuguese was that there was no word for understatement in Portuguese. And I remember thinking how funny that was, because it's her middle name, right? And yeah, the spectacular unspectacular is really lovely. Yeah. Okay.
Well, that seems like a great note to send everyone off on. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. It's a thrill for me to be to kind of open the door and not just be at a desk, to see the readers and speak with them. And April, so wonderful to dwell in these poems with you this month. And I really appreciate your doing this tonight.
Well, it
Thank
was
you.
fun. It's fun, and I'm a, you know, read, Elizabeth Bishop, reader again.
Okay, point taken.
Okay.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Okay.
Thank you,
I hope
April.
we'll do
you.
another one
So good to
soon.
see my friends up there in the gallery, new and old.
Thank you.
Thank you.